In early March this year, the Kremlin got the first in a series of worrying phone calls. It was from the CIA. The Americans thought that a terror attack was about to occur in Moscow. The private call was followed up with a public warning that was broadcast around the world.
This is from the US Embassy in Russia that is warning of a terrorist attack that could take place in Moscow within the next 24 hours.
The warning was fairly specific.
The embassy, through its website, urged all US citizens to leave Russia immediately and added that people should avoid concerts and crowds.
But a week went by and nothing happened. Russian President Vladimir Putin mocked the warnings publicly, saying it was a Western attempt to intimidate and destabilise Russia. But then the Kremlin got another call, this time from Iran. They had the same warning for them. And the CIA and Iran don't tend to collaborate on things like this. On March 22nd, it happened.
An act of terror. Gunmen walked through a Russian concert hall, firing indiscriminately.
144 people were killed and more than 500 wounded.
In a statement, the Islamic State affiliate in Afghanistan, called ISIS-K, claimed it was responsible.
So, open and shut case, right? A horrific terror attack, but no mystery there to be solved. And yet Vladimir Putin said it had something to do with Ukraine.
They tried to hide and were moving in the direction of Ukraine.
And a number of American right-wing YouTubers agreed with him.
The idea that this has nothing to do with Ukraine is frankly just ludicrous.
Will this lead to escalation? I mean, if these people are found out to be like Ukrainian-backed terrorists, totally.
Vladimir Putin must operate under the assumption it was Ukraine.
Fun fact about that. This month, the US Justice Department unsealed an indictment of 2 Russian state media employees. It makes the case that they were funneling millions of dollars into the pockets of those same YouTubers. The indictment alleges that the Russians specifically asked that one of the commentators blame Ukraine and the US for the attack, which they agreed to do. But this is bigger than that one attack and this one claim. By and large, the money being funneled from the Russian government to American YouTubers came with no strings attached. They just wanted to help boost their message. A message Russia really likes. That US foreign policy is bad, Ukraine is bad, Joe Biden is bad, the CIA is bad, and Donald Trump is good. The YouTubers say that they are victims of a criminal scheme and didn't know that they were being paid by Russia. And that may be true. But whether they knew or not, it's not the first time that something like this has happened. There's a long history of foreign adversaries covertly paying Americans to spread fake news to other Americans. But is the internet making it easier? And can it be stopped? I'm Matt Bevan, and this is If You're Listening. So, like I said, enemy state-sponsored fake news has been a thing basically as long as news has been a thing. In the late 1930s, governments around the world cracked down on foreign propaganda coming into their country. The US was no different. It brought in a law, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, that said anyone lobbying on behalf of a foreign government had to register with the State Department. So if you're writing news, fake or otherwise, for the German Nazi government, you have to register first. As war broke out, it was used to shut down Nazi propaganda networks operating in the US print media. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite.
This is London calling in the overseas service of the British Broadcasting Corporation.
In World War II, both sides of the war set up propaganda stations on shortwave radio.
From Berlin, from Rome, from Tokyo, the campaign started. Propaganda to confuse, divide, soften up their intended victim.
These days we're all familiar with AM and FM radio, but back in the 1940s, all the buzz was about shortwave radio. And I mean buzz literally. The sound quality is terrible. But with a bit of money behind you, you could transmit really long distances, even across oceans. civilians.
Germany calling, Germany calling.
So everyone knew that you ran the risk of being fed propaganda if you scanned the shortwave stations. But they also knew that their own newspapers were being censored, and they were hungry for news of the war. There was good info to be found out there, especially if you stuck to American shows. In March 1942, with US troops in combat in the Pacific and preparing for war in Europe, American civilians were scanning the airwaves for news, and many came across a new show called Station Debunk. Shortwave stations weren't on air 24 hours a day. Generally, they'd pop up in the evening or in the early morning and play music while people settled in to listen.
Station Debunk is on the air every night at 8:30 p.m. Central War Time. Before we start our program, we will entertain you with Nobody's Sweetheart. We will start our program immediately after the music.
So you might finish your dinner, then gather your family and the people next door, and settle in around the wireless to listen to some uncensored, unbiased American coverage of the war against Japan and the Nazis.
Invite your neighbors over to listen in with you.
Each night, an American voice would come on air, claiming to be broadcasting from somewhere in the American Midwest, and promising to tell listeners what was really going on with the war.
The American people have been suffering from this misinformation for the last few years.
Each nightly broadcast started with some music, followed by a news bulletin.
Flash from London, England. The British are combing the world for cannon fodder to fight their war for them.
Interesting news. Doesn't sound all that objective.
The British have relied on their dominions, their colonies, and their allies to do all their fighting. The colonies and allies were dumb enough to do it.
The quote-unquote news was also quite anti-Semitic and racist.
It might become necessary to stop the flow of Mexican labor into the United States because of the large number of contagious diseases being carried into the country by the Mexicans.
After the news, a man who was introduced as Joe Scanlon then did a long monologue.
Tonight, Joe Scanlon will continue his efforts to deliver our country from the hands of those scamps who are now in power.
Scanlon's monologue was devoted to one thing: attacking US President Franklin D. Roosevelt for declaring war on Germany.
We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
It is something so terrible, so inhuman, that any man should have been willing to send millions of boys in the prime of their youth to death, merely in order to hold on to his job. In fact, if that is true, it is nothing less than high treason.
But listeners quickly noticed something weird about Joe Scanlon. He seemed to be quite behind the times news-wise, and his music collection was also a bit outdated. He talked endlessly about how American public opinion was against the war, but this was at a time when polls showed more than 90% of Americans were supportive of FDR's actions.
I would not send our boys to be slaughtered and butchered on foreign battlefields in order to restore to the international Jews their money, their property, and their influential positions in Europe.
In fact, his information seemed to line up better with German propaganda than anything that was actually happening in America. It was almost as though he wasn't broadcasting from an undisclosed location in Iowa at all, but was instead sending shortwave signals from the centre of the Third Reich. Within weeks of the first broadcast, the truth was all over the American papers. Station Debunk was coming from Germany, one of 19 similar stations set up by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, which broadcast in different languages to England, Scotland, the Soviet Union, and India. Far from looking out at all American cornfields, Scanlon was probably in a bunker, dodging daily bombing raids from the Allies.
It is a wonder that the people of the United States do not land in Washington and New York, establish a second front there, and drive the internationalists out of the temple.
There was no way to block his broadcasts. All the Americans could do was tell people he was fake and advise them not to listen. The only way to stop him was to defeat Germany.
President Truman officially announces the end of German resistance.
After they did that, Joe Scanlon was arrested in Frankfurt. His name was actually Herbert John Bergman. He'd worked as an economist at the US Embassy in Berlin before the war. As Joe Scanlon, he was paid 9 times the average German wage to write and broadcast half-hourly daily shows. In 1949, he was convicted of treason and died in prison in 1953. It's pretty clear that Station Debunk didn't actually achieve much, but the Nazis were onto something. Propaganda from an enemy is much more likely to work if it's delivered by one of your own, in an American accent, from someone claiming to be an American patriot.
Who do you think we are? Where do you think we're coming from? What do you know about Russia today?
In 2005, 25-year-old Margarita Simonyan was put in charge of a new TV channel aimed at changing global opinions about Russia. A 24-hour English-language news channel broadcast out of Moscow called Russia Today.
This image of Russia should be more fair to the country.
As the years went on, the channel evolved. It opened bureaus around the world and changed its name to RT. From there, it became stranger. It promised to air points of view that were being censored by the global media with a new slogan: question more.
I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. Question more.
Question more.
RT would interview conspiracy theorists or broadcast anti-Western news reports.
Russophobia is at an all-time high.
If you watch this Western television, you're going to see that Russia is a pure hell, but nevertheless, it's a pure heaven.
Some of its journalists felt that all this was a bit problematic.
I'm proud to be an American and believe in disseminating the truth. And that is why, after this newscast, I'm resigning.
In 2017, the US State Department demanded that RT and its journalists register under the good old Foreign Agents Registration Act. And then, after Putin ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, RT was blocked in most Western countries. The boss, Margarita Simonyan, was sanctioned by the US, EU, UK, Ukraine and Australian governments, among others. So RT is gone. Except in January this year, Simonyan said something interesting on Russian TV.
В этих странах, и в частности в США, мы стали работать, как бы сказать, подпольное дело. Мы организовали ряд партизан.
A number of guerrilla projects. Interesting. How could something like that work? Well, American YouTuber Tim Pool has a theory.
So what happens with social media, particularly YouTube, where it's really easy, you can have a foreign agent or even the government or some corporation or whatever say, this guy talks about things that we really like. Dump ad money into his channel through Google AdSense and they'll never know we were the ones funding him and you can't prove it.
What an intriguing idea. Paying to help spread the message of people who are saying things you agree with. Speaking of which, here's something else that Tim Pool says.
Ukraine is the enemy of this country. Ukraine is our enemy.
See, there are a bunch of American commentators who make a living talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine.
We can prove that Ukraine, with America's help, has become a terror state.
More specifically, like Joe Scanlon, they broadcast long monologues about why the United States should stay out of it.
Ukraine is precisely the kind of country that we swore to fight against during the global war on terror.
They've been doing this pretty much since the beginning of the war.
Ukraine is the greatest threat to this nation and to the world. We should rescind all funding and financing, pull out all military support, and we should apologize to Russia.
These two guys, Benny Johnson and Tim Pool, are right-wing social media influencers, each with more than 1 million followers on YouTube. They're contrarians. They're all about challenging the status quo, criticising the American liberal elites, President Joe Biden, and globalism. They say that they are there to debunk the liberal media narrative, and they say that the solution to all problems is Donald J. Trump.
The moment Trump becomes president, he's on the phone with Putin, he's on the phone with Zelensky, and he says, stop fighting, we're going to talk. The fighting stops, the war's over.
But much like in the 1940s, getting to a position where millions of people listen to you every time you speak isn't cheap. You need to advertise, you need staff. That's where billionaire Belgian free speech advocate Edward Gregorian comes in. In February 2023, some of these right-wing influencers, including Tim Pool and Benny Johnson, were contacted by a company called Tenet Media. The company said they were being funded by Mr. Gregorian and asked if the influencers would be willing to come on board and make videos for them in exchange for lots of money. $100,000 a video.
It is Ukraine that is in control of this country, and the Ukraine lobby is too powerful.
In fact, Edward Gregorian did not exist. He'd been created by 2 Russian employees of RT. The company he was funding, Tenet Media, was created by 2 Canadian former employees of RT. The gig they were being paid for was to make videos for Tenet Media. Now, none of these videos really found an audience, but that didn't really matter. The fake billionaire Gregorian still got his money's worth. Together, these influencers were paid $10 million in just over a year in which they also made hundreds of sympathetic videos for their own channels. This month, the Russians involved were charged under the good old Foreign Agents Registration Act. Though they're in Russia, so they're not actually going to see a day in a US court. The Justice Department says this isn't the only operation either. They say RT is funding media outlets in Africa and, ironically enough, Germany. It's a strange indictment, charging Russians in Russia with not registering as foreign agents, but not charging anyone who worked for them. And like the influencers knew they were working for foreign money, but they thought it was euros from Belgium, not rubles from Russia.
Did you read the indictment? It clearly says that I, as well as the other personalities, were victims. We were deceived by people intentionally to trick us into licensing our content to them.
Victims or not, they are going to keep the $10 million. In the age of social media, it's basically impossible for the US to stop foreigners getting involved in their media. The Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938 wasn't really written with YouTube in mind. Like, my salary comes indirectly from the Australian government, and this show has had millions of views in America. Am I an unregistered foreign agent or just a foreign journalist who talks about America? And where's the line between those two things? The reality is, in a country that protects free speech like America, money talks. It amplifies certain messages. It always has. All the US government can do, just as it did in 1942, is tell the public that some messages are being spread and amplified by a foreign adversary. Will that be enough to stop Americans from listening? Probably not.